This is the Tobinski Sequencer. It's a 4-channel analog sequencing powerhouse with a unique and highly playable design that lends itself to complex patching. Here's a little taste of what I've been doing with it. Before I get into the patches, I'll walk you through the basic concepts and controls. This will take a few minutes, so do feel free to skip ahead to the patches if you're already familiar with it. I also need to say a big thanks to Tobinski, the brand formerly known as Danny Sound, for sending over the sequencer and its expander for me to check out, along with the other new modules in the Tobinski branding. If you're subscribed to the channel, and if you're not, please hit that button now, you may have seen the first patch video I did a few weeks ago where I put a dedicated case together based around the Tobinski range. Since then, I've moved the modules into my big case where I have a load more utilities and effects, and a couple of other digital voices from ALM. I'll be basing the patches around this Tobinski zone of the case, which has 2 oscillators, 2 LFOs, 2 envelopes, a filter, a wave folder, a couple of VCAs and LPGs. I've also got the new harmonic timing generator and interpolating scanner, which I'll be using today too, but I'm also planning a separate video about those soon. So let's take a closer look at the sequencer, and I'll explain the core concept behind it. It's based around 2 banks of 8 voltages, which are each addressed by 2 independent sequencers. These sequencers read the same set of voltage values, but they can be clocked independently, they can have different start and end points, and they can run in different directions, with CV control over everything. We have transport and tempo controls for the internal clock here on the right, and a CV input for the tempo with an attenuverter here on the left. There's also a button here to manually advance the sequencer step by step when it's stopped. This middle section lets you set the first and last step for each sequencer, along with the playback direction. It's worth pointing out that when you reverse direction, it doesn't always behave as you might expect. If you have the first step set to 1 and the last step set to 5, for example, when you hit reverse, it won't play 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, it'll play 1, 8, 7, 6, 5, 1, 8, 7, 6, 5, and so on. This kind of makes sense when you think about it. 1 is still the first step, and it's playing backwards, so it'll immediately loop round to the other end and keep going until it reaches the last step, which is 5, but it takes a bit of getting used to. If you wanted to loop in the order 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, you'd need to set 5 as the first step and 1 as the last step. Another thing to note is that if you set both start and end to the same value, it will play through all the steps and then repeat that value, giving you a 9-step sequence. And in this situation, it will play all the steps if you reverse it. Like I say, it takes a bit of getting used to, but the creative possibilities are quite interesting. The bottom section is where you set the voltages for each step. The sliders have a 0 to 5 volt range, and they're relatively short, so for fine pitch adjustments you might want to reduce the range a bit by running the relevant output through an attenuator. And in case it's not obvious, there's no internal pitch quantizer here. The 2 rows of LEDs show the active step for each of the 2 sequencers that are reading the bank of voltages, and the switch is set whether each step is on or off. If a step is set to off, it will hold the CV value of the previous step and it won't put out a gate. There's also a slide setting where the voltage will smoothly glide to the defined value across one clock cycle. I should mention that for glide to work properly, it needs a falling saw wave as the clock signal rather than a regular pulse. The internal clock produces this kind of signal, as does the harmonic timing generator. If you clock the individual tracks with external pulses, it will still advance the sequence as normal, but you'll lose the ability to add slides or adjust the gate length, which is a feature of the expander that I'll come on to in a minute. All the inputs and outputs are at the top, which keeps the bottom nicely clear for performance. At the top left we have voltage outputs and corresponding gate outputs for each of the 4 sequences, plus outputs for the sum of the voltages on sequences 1 and 2, and the sum of 3 and 4. There are also voltage and gate outputs for sequences based on internally chaining tracks 1 and 3 and 2 and 4, which let you create longer sequences. There are jumpers on the back that determine when the switching happens, either at the end of each sequence, in which case each sequence plays through once in turn, then they repeat, or you can choose to always switch at the end of the left-hand sequence, which is a really interesting approach. There are inputs that let you change each track's direction. A trigger here just toggles a change. And there are end-of-sequence pulse outputs for each track, which are really powerful for creating complex sequence interactions, as you'll see in some of the patches. There are reference clock inputs for each sequencer here, which is how you can clock them all independently. As I mentioned, these need a falling sawtooth for the slide and adjustable gate length to work, but they'll advance just fine with standard 5-volt gates and triggers, including those from the end-of-sequence pulse outputs. Finally, there are various transport control ins and outs at the top right. Reset in sets all sequences to step 1. Start in sets all sequences to their loop start positions and starts the internal clock if it's not already running. Start out puts out a constant high 5-volt signal when the sequencer is running. Step in triggers one cycle of the internal clock, and it's what you use to drive the whole sequencer from an external clock source. You can use the tempo control to match things up so that the internal saw completes exactly one full cycle between incoming pulses. Stop in is a stop and continue input. A pulse here stops and then another one restarts the clock without resetting the step positions. Lastly, the reference out is a copy of that internal falling sawtooth clock for syncing other devices. The expander adds a lot more CV inputs, plus a couple of other important features. We have pots and a CV input to set the gate length for each track. As I mentioned, this needs the clock to be a falling saw wave in order to work. The next pot is the step order control, and there's a CV input down here for this too. This offers 6 different patterns for rearranging the step order of the sequence for instant variations. Then there's a strobe push button for each track, which is quite interesting. When this is pressed, the sequencer stops advancing with the clock and instead stays locked on the loop start step. The CV input for the loop start is just below it, and with strobe engaged you can use this to address the sequencer via CV. This works right up to audio rate too, so if you patch an external oscillator to the loop start input, it will scan through the stages on each cycle and you can use the sliders to draw a wave shape, turning the sequencer into a kind of graphic VCO. Very cool, I'll demonstrate this later. Finally, we have a row of CV inputs for each of the 4 sequences, letting you control the gate length, reset to step 1, reset to the loop start. There's a hold step input, which is a bit like a voltage controlled strobe button. It stops the sequencer advancing when it gets a gate. And to round it off, there's a CV input for the loop end and one for the step order. Right, apologies, that was a lot of talking. Let's start making some music with it. So let's get started with a patch where I'm going to use the sequencer to drive 2 independent melodic voices, but I'm going to use all 4 tracks of the sequencer to achieve some transposition and some extra modulation, just to kind of show you how these sequences can interact to produce some more complex results. For the clocking, I'm going to use the harmonic timing generator over here. I've set the tempo of this, or my kind of bass timing frequency of this, to be quarter notes, and I'm going to use the ×2 output to clock track 4 on the sequencer, which would be my bass voice, and I'm going to use the ×4 output, so that's 16th notes effectively, to clock track 2, which is going to be my melodic voice. And let's listen to that first of all. I've set track 2 to start at step 4 and finish at step 8. If you look at the start and end points there on the loop. So it's going to be a 5-step sequence, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If I get that going, so I've got the gate output of 2 triggering an envelope, and I've got the CV output of 2 running through my quantizer into the EN129, saw wave through the multimode ladder filter, and through the VCA mode and the dual LPG VCA. Very, very simple subtractive voice, very simple 5-note sequence. But I've set the end pulse out from track 2 to clock track 1, and I've set track 1 start and end points to be steps 1, 2 and 3. So I've effectively got 2 completely independent sequences across these 8 voltages. The first 3 are being used by track 1, the last 5 are being used by track 2, and the ones on track 1 are changing every 5 notes. So basically this plays through once, then it moves to the next, and so on. If you just listen to the pitches from track 1, I'm still using the gate out from 2, so we're getting 5 notes on each of these. And if I take the 1 plus 2 output, this will sum that with this. So we'll effectively have this 5-note sequence playing through at root, transposed up a fourth, and then transposed up an octave. So we now have a 15-step sequence, which is based on this 5-step sequence playing 3 times at different transpositions. And if we mute one of the steps, and add a bit of reverb, and I'm also going to take the track 2 output, which is now available again because I'm using the 1 plus 2. I'm going to use that to the second CV input of my filter, just so we're going to get some filter modulation that follows the kind of melodic curve of that line. Quite subtle, but when you've got these extra voltage outputs, it's nice to use them. So that's my melodic part. Just turn that down a second. My bass voice is track 4, which is another 5-step sequence, but this time on 8th notes. That sounds like this. And I'm doing the same thing again where I'm using the end pulse out to clock the track 3, which is using the first 3 steps. So it's exactly the same setup, but rather than this track 3, these 3 slower steps transposing the bass line, they're actually feeding modulation to the wave shape on the oscillator that I'm using, which is the Kaliosc. So that's shaping from a sine to a square wave. So we get one playthrough as a sine, one sort of halfway to a square, and then all the way to a square. And this voice is just going through the other side of the dual LPG VCA, but in LPG mode. And again, just an envelope from the ADSR. So we've got a 5-step 8th note sequence there. And I've got another output from the harmonic timing generator syncing an external drum machine. So if I bring up the kick drum, just to anchor this patch a bit, bring up some other drums. Now if we play with these 5 sliders on the melodic voice, because of this transposition, you get much more complex patterns just from a single note change. And just to liven up this melody line even more, I've got it running through the Time Machine just off screen from Olivia Arts. So add a bit of delay to that as well. For one final bit of modulation, I'm going to take an LFO from the LFO's module and modulate the saw wave shape on the IM129, which will kind of shift it up and down an octave slowly with this slow LFO. So these 2 sequences, with the addition of some transposing and slowly sequenced modulation, really bring this 2 simple 5-step sequences to life a bit. Next I want to look at using the expander to modulate the start and end point of the loop on one of the sequences. I'm basically going to use the manual controls to define a 4-step loop within the 8, and then by modulating the start and end simultaneously with the same CV source, we can kind of scrub that loop through the 8 steps, which can be quite interesting. Let's listen to the full 8-step sequence. So I've got track 1 voltage output going through the quantizer into the N129 with a triangle wave through an LPG, and the gate output from track 1 is just triggering an envelope to open that LPG, and the sequence, the full 8 steps, sounds like this. And if I set the loop end point, so we've just got the first 4 steps looping now, and I've got a manual offset voltage from Quadrat in this palette just at the bottom of the screen. That's going into the loop start and end, which I've multed together in the expander. So if I turn this up, we're now getting steps 2, 3, 4 and 5 looping, and now 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. You'll notice sometimes one changes before the other, so we end up with a 5-step loop, and now we're back into a 4-step loop again. So that loop scrubbing is quite good, but we could sequence that using one of the other sequences. So you notice track 2 is running all 8 steps while this is looping 4 steps. And similar to the first patch, I'm going to take the end pulse out from sequencer 2 to drive sequencer 3, which I've set up with another 4-step sequence, which you can see if you follow the step 3 LEDs, or the sequence of 3 LEDs rather, stepping through those 4 steps. We'll get 2 repetitions of the 4-step loop before that changes. So if I take sequence of 3 output and modulate the start and end point of that loop on track 1 again, so this is now doing what I was doing manually. Now we're getting 2 repetitions of each 4-step loop. Let's up the tempo a little bit. And let's make the voice a bit more interesting by adding some through 0 FM. I've got the same pitch sequence that's sending that main oscillator, that's going into Kalios as well. So if I turn up the through 0 FM, I've got a sine wave there going into the FM input. Gives us a nice, slightly more harmonically rich sound. And then for a bit more interest, because I've still got that sequence 2 running across all 8 steps, let's take sequencer 2 through the quantizer and into the Kalios. So now we've got an 8-step sequence on the modulating oscillator, so we get this kind of quite harmonically fun, bit more varied polymetric modulation going on, where some notes are quite metallic and atonal. And we've got one sequencer output left, sequencer 4. I've set that up as a 5-step sequence there, running at the main tempo. Let's just use that to modulate the decay time on the envelope. So with this cross modulation happening again, a bit of polymetric FM, got quite a fun little patch. So this next patch needs a little bit of explaining. I'm going to use it to explore some kind of polymetric phasing effects with 2 voices. I'm going to use the 2 sequences on bank A to play 2 voices. Sequence 1 will just loop through all 8 steps. That's going to play Sizzle, just at the top of the screen here. And sequence 2 is going to play the Kalios. And on sequence 2, I'm going to gradually adjust the loop length so that it goes from 8 steps to 7 to 6 to 5 to 4 to 3. To control that loop length change, I'm going to use sequence 3. So it's kind of similar to the previous patch. I'm going to slowly advance through the values on sequence 3, which are going to modulate the loop end point of sequence 2. The difference with the previous patch is the way in which I'm going to advance this sequence. So rather than just whenever one of these first sequences reaches its end, a pulse goes out and advances this, the way I'm going to do it is take the 2 end pulse outputs for tracks 1 and 2. They're going to go through a logical AND gate, which is the new systems babble I'm just using over on the left of the case, and then into the reference in for 3, which means this will only advance when they both happen at the same time. And what this means in practice is that we're going to get them playing through all 8 steps together, both end pulses will fire at the same time. The AND gate will let that through to advance this. That will then set loop 2's endpoint to step 7. So we'll have 7 steps against 8 playing simultaneously. They will continue to loop through in all possible permutations until the end steps line up again. That will be in 56 steps time, 7 times 8. At that point, both those end pulses will fire together. The AND gate will let that through, and it will advance to the next value in sequence 3, which will set the length to 6 steps, and the same process will happen again. And what this means is that we'll have a very long sequence where we're hearing every possible permutation of each of those polymetric pairs. So we're going to get 8 and 8, 8 against 7, which will play through all the permutations, then 8 against 6, which will play through all the permutations, and so on. The other thing to point out in this patch is I'm using sequence 4, which is just set to step 7 and 8, to generate some swing timing. I'm basically setting step 7 to 0 and step 8 to about halfway. That sequence 4 output's going into the CV input of the tempo CV with a little bit of boost there, which means that every alternate step will be slightly faster, which means we'll get this kind of swing timing. Let's just listen to sequence 1 on its own so you can hear that swing, and you'll hear the basic 8 steps, which everything's derived from here. And I've just turned step 3 to off to give it a little bit of rhythmic interest as well. So a very simple sequence going through the quantizer. And if we now listen to the second voice, which is the Kalios through an LPG, you can hear we've immediately jumped to a 7-step loop. If you follow the row 2 LEDs, that'll play through several times. Then we're down to 6, and 5, and 4, and 3. Back to 8 again. And if I bring in both voices, we get this nice complex interlocking pair of melodies which are going to play through in all these permutations and then line up again like that. Try adding a slide. Of course, these slides are being quantized too, so we get these little glissandi. By muting and adding slides, we get some pretty interesting effects as well. Should point out as well, I'm using the 3+4 output to modulate the kind of filter on sizzle, and I'm using the 1+2 output to modulate the wave shape on the Kalios, just for some extra bonus modulation. But otherwise, pretty simple. It's the logical AND gate here that really makes the magic happen by determining how slowly these values in sequence 3 advance. Any rhythmic changes we make here are reflected in these 2 polymetric sequences, which gets much more complex. So next I want to look at using the sequencer at audio rates to turn it into a kind of graphic VCO. This is a really powerful extra dimension to the sequencer that's all possible thanks to the strobe function on the expander. Basically, when you engage strobe on any of the 4 tracks, it decouples that track from the clocking and instead lets you set the active step using the loop start control or the loop start CV input. That means you can feed in an external voltage like an LFO or an oscillator to that loop start CV input and scan through those stages. If you do that fast enough with an oscillator and listen to the output, you can basically draw a waveform using the sliders as the voltage goes up and down during that cycle. Let me show you what I mean first of all using an LFO to that input so we can kind of see what's happening a bit more slowly so it's visible on the LEDs. You need to think about the CV ranges a little bit. It takes 5 volts to sweep through the entire set of 8 steps. I've got an external LFO to start with. This is a rising ramp LFO from the EN129 oscillator in LFO mode. Now that will be running -5 to +5 volts by default, so I need to attenuate that down firstly to half that range, which I'm going to do using the quadrat here. And I'm also going to kind of set the initial loop start position to step 4 in the middle. And then as I bring up this attenuator to about halfway, you'll see that this ramp LFO is scanning through all of those 8 steps in order. And of course you don't have to use a ramp, you could use a triangle, in which case it'll go up and down, or a sine wave, which will have the timing slightly different, and I'll explore that in a minute. But just to give you the general idea, a -2.5 to +2.5 wave is what I've effectively got going in now because of the attenuation, and because of that offset position set by the loop start initially, it's given me that full range. So if I jump this up from LFO to audio range, now we won't be able to follow those LEDs anymore because they're going so fast, and you can see on the scope down here I'm drawing effectively a square wave. I've got 4 sliders down, 4 sliders all the way up. And if I bring up the audio of this, I'm just running it through a low pass gate, I'm just going to manually open it. Now if I adjust the tuning on the oscillator, that follows along. And if I play with these sliders, you can see on the scope, I know it's quite small, you can see I'm drawing these different wave shapes. You can go from a single, very narrow pulse to something more stepped, to something kind of approximating a triangle, going up and down, or something approaching a saw if you just go up in order like that. So we can also just run the other sequencer tracks as normal, because track 1's in strobe mode, the other sequencers aren't. So if I just hit start, I'm taking sequencer 3 through the quantizer, and sequencer 3's gate is going to an envelope to open that low pass gate. So now I can use these sliders to play with the shape of the oscillator in real time. I should say also that you can now play with the loop start manually, and you get a kind of PWM effect if you look at the scope. So easy to do PWM manually with that. You can also try different shapes. Let's try a triangle. And we get this more symmetrical kind of wave shape. We can try a sine as well, which will be similar to the triangle. So there's a really good range of waves you can just draw. And we can also play with the step order control. Again, this would be quite obvious if you go back to a square kind of shape. By just in that step order we get these other shapes. And of course we can sequence that step order. Let's take the sequencer 4 output and go into the sequencer 1 step order control. So yeah, as you can see, it's a pretty powerful oscillator with some unique sound shaping kind of tools available. So here's quite a fun patch to explore ratcheting effects, which I've basically taken from the manual and evolved very slightly. The general idea here is that sequencer 1 is going to control a melodic voice, so I've got the ALM and Chemi's Castle off screen, and the voltage output 1 and gate output 1 are going to kind of play that as normal. That's set up for an 8-step sequence to begin with. Sequencer 2 is set up as a 4-step sequence, and I'm just going to use the end pulse out from sequencer 2 to advance sequencer 3. So every 4 steps of that, sequencer 3 will advance, similar to those previous patches where we're getting a kind of slowly moving sequence over here linked to that first bank. It's the sequencer 3 sliders that will determine whether the ratcheting effect happens on a particular step. With the faders down at the bottom, nothing will happen, and with the fader at the top, the effect will be introduced. And the way this works is sequencer 3's voltage output will take that high voltage, and I'm going to mult it to 3 different places. Firstly, to the tempo CV input, so when that step's high, it's going to speed up the clock and produce extra clock pulses. While that's happening, another copy is going to be going to the hold step input on sequencer 1, so it's going to keep it on whatever note it's currently on, and those clock pulses will fire repeated faster rhythms on that same note. And thirdly, via an inverter, it's going to go to the gate length CV input on sequencer 1 as well. So when those fast ratchet events are happening, it's going to reduce the length of the gate by having negative CV going into it and reducing that gate time to accommodate those ratchets. Let's have a listen. This is just the sequencer 1 voice on its own, just the 8-step sequence. It's this kind of dirty sine wave from a Chemy's Castle with no real modulation happening. You hear a lot of aliasing and transients, which is nice, dirty retro kind of sound. If I was to turn up one of these steps on sequencer 3, you'll hear that ratcheting effect. Let's make sequencer 3 5 steps long. And let's make sequencer 1 7 steps long. I've got sequencer 4 set up as well with just 3 steps, 6, 7, 8 at the end. I'm going to use that to modulate the multiplier on the oscillator, so octave shifting effectively. Which makes this voice sound a bit more interesting. I'm going to take sequencer 2, just that 4-step sequence. I'm going to use that to control the level of the modulating oscillator in a Chemy's Castle. So introducing some FM effect here. And I'm going to take the 1+2 output, which is just a kind of combination of the first 2 tracks, and I'm going to use that to control the multiplier on voice 1 as well. On my modulating oscillator, rather. So now these various voltage outputs are producing lots of quite interesting modulation in the voice. Of course, I can play with the sequence. Play with the position of those ratchets. Play with the direction. I just love how this pretty simple sequence, this 7-step sequence, is now producing all this beautiful modulation, making this voice just generate itself away into these lovely little patterns. So to finish, I'm going to use the sequencer alongside some other drum sounds to create a kind of atonal, percussion-y kind of element for an electro groove. Let's just get the sequence going. I'll explain how I've got it set up. So we're driving a triangle wave from the EN129 through the low-pass gate with an envelope from the ADSR, pretty standard. I've got the 1 to 3 switching output set up, so I've got a longer sequence than usual. I've got a 16-step sequence. It's running through steps 1 to 8. Then it's switching to sequence 3, and it's looping these first 3 steps for 8 steps in total. I'm taking the sequence 2 output, which I've got ping-ponging. That's playing in full and then bouncing back again. I'm using the end pulse out sequence 2 to flip the direction, and I've got the start and end both set to 1. I'm going to use that sequence 2 output via an attenuator to modulate the decay time of the envelope. So we're just going to get some steps slightly longer than others. I should say as well that the pitch CV isn't being quantized. I'm also running the pitch CV output through an attenuator so I can just control the range of it. doesn't really need to be in tune, as you'll see in a minute. I'm taking the Sequence 4 output into the other oscillator, the Kalios, and I'm going to take the output of that, the sine wave, into the log FM input. If I bring in some FM, Sequence 4 is just playing a 5-step simple looping sequence here. I'll just set that out a second. If I add a slide or two and mute a couple of steps, I'm going to get this rhythm a little bit more complex. I should say as well, I'm driving this from the BeatStep Pro into the step input, and I've adjusted the tempo so it kind of matches the tempo on the BeatStep Pro, so these slides should last for a full beat. Let's bring that FM back in. So that pitch sequence on the Kalios doesn't really have any relation to the one on the first, which means we get this quite nice atonal West Coast spooklery kind of tone. Let's bring in the rest of the drums. So I'll leave it there for now. Hopefully these patches are giving you a taste of how powerful the sequencer is. There are loads of other great patch ideas in the manual, so I highly recommend giving that a read too. I'll be back soon with a video on the harmonic timing generator and interpolating scanner, but in the meantime, thanks for watching, hit subscribe if you haven't already, leave a comment and thumbs up if you've enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.